Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us, and a very warm welcome to this British Coffee Association webinar on coffee and climate change, the future. This is the first in our In Conversation With series, and today we are delighted to be in conversation with Dr. Aaron Davis and Dr. Caspar, both of Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. Guys, we are so grateful to you for agreeing to take part in this conversation today, especially since coming off the back of the COP26 Climate Summit. Climate change and sustainability are at the forefront of everyone's thoughts, individuals and industry alike, really. And obviously the research work that both of you are involved in focuses on crops and climate change resilience, sustainability and adaptation. So it's almost like we planned this. Welcome to everybody. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end, so please do. You can type them in the comments or questions box there, and we'll get round to asking those. We've got great attendance today from people who work in a variety of roles across the coffee industry, a hugely significant industry, as we all know. According to research by the British Coffee Association, around 2 billion cups of coffee are consumed around the world every day. 100 million farmers are involved in growing coffee to supply that demand, and the global coffee market is valued in excess of 100 billion US dollars. But as we digest the details coming out of COP26 and the challenges involved in limiting global warming, we're asking today what the future holds for coffee in terms of production amid a warming planet. Coffee, of course, is a perennial crop. It's susceptible to the effects of climate change, namely drought and temperature changes. And Brazil is the world's leading exporter of coffee and produces almost 40% of the global supply. As we know already, production there has been hit particularly hard recently by frosts, by drought and leaf rust disease. So what are the options? How can coffee adapt? What are the risks and also the opportunities presented by climate change? Dr. Aaron Davis, who joins us as Senior Research Leader of Plant Resources and Head of Coffee Research at Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. You've been investigating pathways, Aaron, for adaptation in regards to coffee crops. Tell us about those.
Yeah, so, let's say about 10, 12 years ago, we wanted to really understand the risks posed by climate change for coffee, and perhaps the opportunities as well. So we did that. We'd started working in East Africa, and we actually looked at the Ethiopian coffee sector and how that was being affected by climate change and what that would look like across this century. And then doing that work, we sort of understood where the risks and opportunities would be. And then the sort of focus was really on solutions. What would we do in Ethiopia and in other parts of the world where coffee production was part of their major economy? So essentially, there are three pathways. We can adapt the farm, we change the microclimate by using irrigation, extra shade, mulching. Secondly, we can change the crop itself. That's either change the cultivar of coffee we use, say a different type of Arabica, or change the species, say to Robusta, or look at something completely different, a new species, a new hybrid. And then I guess the final phase in that stage is to actually say, look, we can't grow coffee anymore, let's switch to another crop. And then the third option is to move coffee or to move coffee production areas. So as the climate becomes unsuitable in some areas, but more suitable in others, those areas will come into production in some farming areas. And indeed, we're seeing that in East Africa and particularly in Ethiopia, where people who've been growing coffee for many generations are no longer able to grow coffee in a profitable way. And farming areas that have almost never grown coffee suddenly find that there is suitability or increasing suitability and are growing coffee for the first time. So there are new coffee areas opening up in Ethiopia, for example, and in places that are much higher in elevation than ever before. So we always used to say 2,000 meters was the maximum elevation in Ethiopia, and now it's up to 2,600 meters. So really quite a shift. And the feedback we are getting from farmers is that, and people on the ground, is that coffee is on the move. The trouble with that option is there's land use issues. That land is probably being used for something else by somebody else, or there could be a nature reserve. And the thing you really want to avoid, of course, is moving people. You do not really want to see human migration in any form, really, to try and overcome this issue. But from what we've seen so far of those three options, for many parts of the coffee producing world, the second option, that is change the crop, holds the most promise. And I think we're going to go into that in some detail this afternoon.
I think we are. We're going to talk to you about this. It's a rediscovered species, really, isn't it? As opposed to a new one. It's a Coffeus stenophylla, if I said that right. That was on the go a long time ago, so it's a sort of rediscovered species of coffee as opposed to a new one, isn't it? And that's what some of your research work's been focusing on recently.
Yeah, that's right. So what we're saying is that we're not going to lose Arabica and Robusta unless something really drastic happens. They'll always be with us, but for some farmers, there will have to be other coffee crops, much more resilient coffee crops. And if you went back from now, say 100, 150 years ago, we were actually growing a greater diversity of crops, including species like Stenophylla and Liberica. Now, Stenophylla is an interesting little coffee because it was, as you say, cultivated at scale in Upper West Africa up until around the 1900s, maybe 1910, and by the 1920s, it had pretty much disappeared. It's interesting for most people because all the historical accounts of the species say that it has a fantastic taste, and one in particular saying that it tastes better than Arabica, which is, of course, is always exciting. For many years we wanted to do more work on this species and sort of assess its potential, but we just couldn't find it, not in the quantities that were required to really evaluate it properly. So the idea was that we would go to Sierra Leone, where it was once cultivated in some quantity. In fact, it was exported to Europe, but we couldn't find it. It just wasn't available on farms, etc. Agronomists didn't know anything about it, so what we had to do was go back to the places it was found in the wild and reintroduce it from the wild. It was last seen in Sierra Leone in 1954, and we did find it, but after some considerable effort. It's a rare, threatened species. It's really quite rare in the wild now. So it's now, this was at the end of 2018, and it's now been propagated successfully and has just started to be planted out in Sierra Leone. So the interesting thing, one of the things that we really wanted to verify when we sort of refound this in Sierra Leone was that of course, the flavor. We wanted to understand or confirm that those sort of very old, over 100 years old, historical reports that it had a good flavor. And in the end, we had several panels, I think 9 panels, and they all agreed that it was commercial, and it did. 80% of the judges, and it was a blind assessment, said that it tasted like Arabica coffee. It's not quite the same. It's got some different flavor attributes and notes, but when we first tasted it in London, we thought it was very much like a Rwandan Bourbon Arabica. That's how specific it was, in terms of being like Arabica. So yeah, really interesting. And then we published a paper earlier this year which shows that although it tastes like Arabica, it's from a completely different environment, a much hotter, partially seasonal environment. And in fact, its annual mean temperature requirement is 6.2 to 6.8 degrees Celsius greater than Arabica. So it really does grow in hotter places. And that was a great surprise to all of us, to have that Arabica flavor profile in places where you would grow Robusta. So it has two very important attributes that we know of, and the early reports also say that it's has some resistance to coffee leaf rust. So that could be really exciting as well.
Yeah, absolutely. As we know, that's something that's damaged a lot of the crop in Brazil of late, and that's actually somewhere I'd like to bring you into this as well, Caspar, in terms of disease that affects coffee plants, and leaf rust being one of them. And in your line of research, you work within the gene editing phase of this. So how could gene editing potentially work with respect or regard to coffee, and potentially adjusting that so that it would become more resilient to disease like that?
So gene editing is a name for a kind of suite of different tools, usually using what are called nucleases, which are a type of protein that with a guide RNA, you can target specific genes or specific codes in the DNA of the plant to then change the sequence of that DNA. So it's a very, very precise way of making those changes that you would normally make through a less or non-targeted breeding program. So normally a breeder would identify a trait that they are interested in, for example, disease resistance or some other stress resistance, or of course yield. And they would then look at a population of maybe elite lines, coffee lines in this example, and the breeder would select for that trait and improve upon it based on the pool of genes available in that population. But in gene editing, what you have is a tool to identify a gene, and for coffee, we already have a genomic level, so we know the coffee genome of several different coffees, and using that information, we can then target specific genes to change them how we see fit. For example, if we see that particular coffee varieties are susceptible to a particular disease, we can identify through population genomics and other kind of statistical approaches the cause of that weakness, or the opposite, the cause of the strength in that trait. And so you know the gene, you know therefore the target, and you can change that gene using gene editing to introduce the trait of interest. That's more or less how you'd go about it.
Easy, sounds so easy. In terms of actually getting the plant, then if you have edited it, obviously forgive my lack of scientific language, but if you sort of switch off, this genome or part of the plant's DNA that's susceptible to whether it's drought or temperature or coffee leaf rust, for example, how then what is the process for then propagating that? How's that done in layman's terms?
Sure. Well, it very much depends on the material you start with. I mean, just like going back to traditional breeding, if you put rubbish in, you're going to get rubbish out. But if you start with an elite line, a coffee that has got excellent flavor profile and other properties, then the gene edited coffee that you get from that will be more or less fit for market, assuming it passes all other regulatory processes. Similarly, if you target genes that may have knock-on effects in other processes. So, for example, if you target this gene for rust resistance, maybe it has negative effects on yield. Well, you don't want that. So it's not fit for market, but you have starting material for the breeder to then introduce that trait into better varieties. So it's kind of a balancing act in that case.
And then if we're talking, I suppose we're talking about two different things here, the way that sort of new technologies like gene editing can do that, or also, Aaron, with your rediscovered species, and you're saying that that's Stenophylla has been propagated and sort of grown at the moment. How long then for both of those instances for the product to come to market? You know, I take it it's a really lengthy process.
Yeah, I do want to start with the traditional approach, which is, you know, coffees are slightly different to many other crop plants in that it's not truly domesticated. I mean, it has been sort of slightly domesticated, of course, because cultivars have been selected and hybrids have been produced, but not so much as other plants. And in fact, you can take wild Robusta and wild Arabica, as long as you do a nice selection, grow it up, and you've got essentially a crop plant. And you can't do that with many other crops. So for something like Stenophylla, you're restricted by the time that it takes for the seed to grow and the plant to produce coffee beans, which we think is going to be about at least 4 years, maybe 7 years. But you know, it depends on a number of factors. But it could happen quite quickly. But what we are trying to do with Stenophylla is that to get a crop ready as soon as possible, but during that process of bulking up Stenophylla is to find the best variants we can. So it's sort of like a selection process. So we're taking Stenophyllus from different places, and if we see one that has higher productivity, a better taste, more disease resistance, or a combination of those characters, that's the one you would want to ideally bulk up, propagate, and, you know, essentially domesticate, and that could take a bit longer. So we might see some initial Stenophylla production within, say, 4 to 7 years, but it might be 10 years, 15, 20 years before we get an improved Stenophylla that's more suitable for, you know, more profitable for farmers. But we just don't, you know, we just don't know at this moment what that process or how successful that process will be.
And what would you say in terms of the approach that your focus and research takes, Caspar? Similar period of time, or?
It's so gene editing is a pretty new technology, and the end product of gene editing is something that in theory could be obtained through traditional breeding techniques, but in theory, gene editing is a much faster, cleaner, more direct approach. So in that sense, it's quicker than normal traditional breeding methodologies. But the caveat is that you have to get into gene editing through GM, through genetic modification. And that's the major stumbling block for regulatory reasons and the traditional public backlash that occurred over the last 20 or more years around genetic engineering. And I know that coffee producers have been interested in genetic engineering of coffee for a long time, both in the US, such as in Hawaii, in Mexico, Brazil, and only recently has that been readdressed because there was such an outcry over this method. And unfortunately, there's a strong brand associated with, you know, non-GMO products. And even though the end product of gene editing is non-GMO, the process to produce it is not. So this is a real grey area, and one that's being looked at actively by governments and regulators in Europe and the UK and elsewhere. But in answer to your question, you have to do the GMO part, which involves very careful tissue culture. So Aaron mentioned the germination of the seeds and growth into adult plants. Well, in gene editing, you're using what's called tissue culture, where you start from single cell and callus and work on that kind of material. So there's that element of it, and then there's the selection of your individual plants of interest that carry the gene edits you're interested in, and then trying to understand how that change has affected the plant. So it's a lengthy process. You can't get away from that, and it's all the more complicated by the type of plant you're trying to modify, trying to change. So because you've got a woody tissue plant, they're quite resistant to gene editing. I mean, trees are more difficult than a very very simple crop plant.
Yeah.
And so you're talking a bit about sort of public skepticism there against gene edited plants, and Aaron, you mentioned about the species that you've been looking into, Stenophylla. Is there there's 130 coffee species, is that right? And we drink two pretty much, Arabica and Robusta. What's the, if known, what are the coffee companies, or how do they respond to this idea of the divergence away from Arabica and Robusta? Is that proven to be?
Yeah, that's a good question. I just wanted to sort of conclude the sort of piece on sort of the time scales involved. And I think what we're doing with Stenophylla is just working on the species itself. But I think in terms of a real commodity crop, it would involve some form of hybridization or gene editing or something. So it could take 30 years. You know, if you're really going for the next Robusta or the next Arabica. I think the key thing is in terms of climate change, which is what we're discussing here. In Arabica and Robusta, what we're seeing is that really have the potential on their own to really adapt to the changes of the climate that we're going to see over the course of the next several decades, or even in the next 3 or 4 decades. And that's why we need to look outside Arabica and Robusta. So yeah, and we need to do that work now, because we need, well, I keep saying this, we need incremental change. We need really robust new coffees, and we haven't got time for incremental changes, like small step changes. It's got to be really something really robust. But to get to your question, I think that going back, let's go back, say 10 years when I was talking about this at coffee meetings. I think a lot of people in the sector thought it was a bit crazy, and I even heard the word science fiction a couple of times. I think 10 years on, I'm much more confident that this approach is one of the the pathways that we should be taking. And we're already working with some of the large coffee buyers, some of the world's largest coffee companies, and they're behind this. They're not investing as they would in Arabica and Robusta, but I think it's started. And what I think we're also what we are seeing is it's at both ends of the value chain. So there's a huge amount of interest, for example, from baristas. I think the Australian barista champion got to the semi-finals not using Arabica Robusta, but Eugenioides and Liberica. And that's high-level competition, of course. But what we're also seeing is farmers taking up Liberica in preference to Robusta, not only in places like Uganda, but also in South Sudan. So it's already started, I would say. And if you look at the yield potential and agricultural properties of species like Liberica, although they didn't work well in the past, now what we're seeing is there are good tasting variants, and there is an increasing demand for Liberica. So we'll see Liberica become more into the more sort of commodity level before other species. But as you say, there are 130 species. We're trying to test them one by one, but there's still lots of things we don't know about the wild species. So it's very exciting.
Coffee to be drunk.
Yes, yeah.
What would you say, what are the most important aspects to ensure sustainability then under climate change? Obviously, we're talking here about diversification of species. What other things can be done in terms of sort of the coffee sector and a potential strategy going forward there to mitigate or adapt?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting and absolutely the most important question is at the moment. And so the work that Caspar and I do is on the adaptation side. What we really need to be focusing on, and what we do a bit of work on, is the mitigation. So we really need to aim for net zero by 2050, or really before 2050. If you look at the way temperatures have accelerated globally since, say, the 60s or the 80s, it's frightening. You know, in East Africa, we're seeing 0.3 of a degree Celsius every decade. And although the global average is 0.18, in many of the coffee areas it's higher. It's not even all over the world. So we will breach 1.5 and possibly even 2 degrees by 2050, 2060 if we do nothing. So we you know, that's what COP's all been about, of course. It's keeping warming under 1.5, if not 1.5, somewhere close to 1.5. And if we don't do that, then the work that Caspar and I do will be largely irrelevant, because, you know, once we get beyond 2 degrees, I think the coffee sector will be in crisis in terms of production.
Yeah, and Caspar, obviously alongside rising temperature, drought is a key marker of climate change, and your research focuses on improving drought resilience in crops. And can you talk to us about that in the context of coffee crops?
Sure. So the long-term or even short-term climate change forecasts, predictions are that where there are areas of traditional drought, drought-prone areas are only going to get worse. So what that means for a lot of coffee-producing areas and areas in the tropics is that we're going to have much more erratic weather. So there'll be not only much more frequent and perhaps more, well, definitely more pronounced droughts. You'll also have other extreme events such as flooding and storms. So it's a whole mixed bag and it's that unpredictability that's going to impact most on farmers. So you can't really, if you want to plan ahead, you don't know what to do in that case. And for a crop producer and for a farmer, that means serious problems to feed their family and make money. So if we can target just a few of these traits, as you say, drought or water deficit resilience, flooding tolerance, there's all sorts of things that need to be looked at if we want to improve and maintain coffee production in these same areas.
And obviously a huge part of the whole industry is to protect the farmers that are growing the crop, but also protecting the land. And we've seen a bit about deforestation. Obviously that was one of the big announcements that came out of COP on day 2 of the summit. How How can coffee, what part does coffee play, would you say, in deforestation? Are there particular countries or areas that are already affected, and how can we sort of mitigate that going forward?
Yeah, coffee grows in the tropical belt. The tropical belt is mainly covered by forest, and coffee has been a major cause of deforestation. There's no doubt about that, and that goes back centuries, of course, and is still a cause of major deforestation, particularly in South America. The crazy thing is, I think it's largely avoidable. It requires some work and some effort, but there's no point in planting millions of trees if we're cutting down primary rainforest and then putting that carbon into the atmosphere. I mean, that's just simply crazy. So one of the things we really have to do is halt or reverse deforestation. That's absolutely clear. And the paradox, of course, is that coffee can be a cause of deforestation and biodiversity loss, but on the other hand, it can be an agent of biodiversity preservation and forest preservation. So if you look at coffee producing countries like Ethiopia, where coffee is produced in a forestry system or an agroforestry system, the benefits of those producing systems to the environment, to the planet, to local stakeholders and communities is vastly different to those of a high input, high intensity system where you're growing coffee without any shade or very little shade. And I think that's one of the issues in terms of the consumer, the very end of the value chain, because although we have many different types of certification, they have no way of really knowing whether their purchasing choices are doing a good thing or a bad thing. And I think that really has to change, and it will change, because legislation is already up and running to make sure that the value chain is free of deforestation for commodity crops like cocoa, coffee, cotton, etc. So it is happening. But for me, it's compared to decarbonisation, it's an easy win, relatively easy win. And of course, as we deforest, as we lose biodiversity, we lose options for adaptation. Stenophylla coffee, for example, is an endangered species in the wild. And I've said this a few times. I think if we were looking for it in 10 years' time, due to deforestation, it probably wouldn't be there. And in losing that, we lose an option. And that's the same, for many, many crops. That's where our raw materials come from for producing the next generation crop species.
What are your views on the mitigation measures that industries brought in to address deforestation? Because there are some companies who are looking at reforestation. The British Coffee Association's sustainability group recently made a position paper on deforestation, and some of our members had given us some examples of where they have been involved directly in reforestation and other measures to sort of mitigate against deforestation. Is that going far enough, or what more can they do?
Look, I think there's a huge reason to be optimistic, and we're, compared to even 5 years ago, the focus on tree planting, the focus on forest preservation is very, very strong. We've never seen anything like this before. I mean, the pledges in terms of replanting trees or planting trees in new places is overwhelming. It's incredible. What I would say is focus on preserving what we have to begin with, because it's not just the trees that are important, it's the carbon in the soil, it's the carbon in the food chain, etc., etc. Let's preserve what we've got, because you don't produce a rainforest or a biodiverse environment by planting trees. That takes centuries. So let's look after what we've got first. But yeah, I mean, it's a cause for optimism. The fact that so much is being done, including the coffee sector, is probably ahead of many other food sectors in terms of looking at and engaging in tree planting. It's not easy. It's not an easy thing to do. That you have to find somewhere to plant all these trees, and that's not as simple as it seems, because even though it looks like unoccupied, unuseful land, it's probably not. It's probably deforested, or it's probably a grassland for some reason, probably pastoralism, raising cattle. So yeah, it's tricky.
And there are other ways in terms of using technology as well to kind of mitigate against deforestation. Or you've been involved in some mapping some areas where it's happening, or where they can reuse other areas of land. Is that right?
So we're able to, using high resolution satellite imagery, i.e. images from space and remote sensing technologies, we're able to tell intervention agents where to plant trees, not only in terms of environmental suitability, but in the case of coffee, where there would be a return on that planting investment, and where that would work in terms of climate security. So based on the climate change predictions, you'd have to make sure that that investment has some return for stakeholders. So yeah, it's about planting the right tree in the right place at the right time for the right reasons. So there's a lot of work behind that, and both Caspar and I are working on projects where we're using a range of new methodologies and technologies to make sure we have the wherewithal to enforce legislation. So I'm working a bit on coffee, but Caspar's working on soy. So the idea is that the products that reach our supermarkets are deforestation free. I think that's really important.
And Caspar, obviously we had an announcement by the UK government last month about the sort of relaxation in the rules around gene editing to allow for a bit more research here. Is that right? How would that, or could that impact on coffee specifically?
So the relaxation around, or what the government is doing is readdressing those rules. So I don't think that the end result is definitely going to be a relaxation of the rules, but it's looking at reappraising what it means, what these new technologies mean to current legislation, how we should move forward now that the UK is no longer part of the European Union's framework. So in terms of coffee, this will have impacts on the market and on coffee importation if indeed gene edited coffee products come to market over the next few years. And it might mean that it's easier for those products to get to the consumer. It also means that research and development of new coffee varieties by UK-based or UK interest companies can go ahead. There's if something is regulated against, you're much less likely to look into it as a potential option for solving a problem. So I think it's a really good thing that there's this potential for relaxing the rules, and without looking into gene editing as an option, we won't be able to know how far we can go and the benefits that it could bring. I mean, it's a very, very, as I say, it's a very, very clean way of doing something very targeted for potentially really powerful benefits for not only the farmer, but also for the consumer. There are many things such as caffeine levels in the coffee, or perhaps flavor profiles that gene editing could also address. So it's not, I guess it's an endless list of possibilities, you could say.
And sorry, on you go.
Sorry, I just sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I think Caspar can maybe embellish or verify this, but so the products of gene editing are not different from the products of traditional plant breeding. Caspar may have a slightly different opinion on that, or will be able to provide more information. And I think the other thing is that traditional approaches and gene editing approaches could be combined. You know, there's no exclusiveness about this. It's about getting to the right point in time to get the right product to farmers, to producers. Caspar, would you?
Yeah, completely. I mean,
okay.
There's a gene edited plant, assuming that it's been through all the steps to remove the transgenic aspects of that process, is just a regular crop. Yeah.
And we when we look at things like chemistry and flavor profiles, dealing with changing cut profiles is quite difficult with plant breeding. It's quite a lot of effort. So if you have a particular compound which is causing a really unwanted element to the sensory profile, if you could get so far and then knock that out with gene editing, you might get to where you want to get.
And looking at the coffee rust again specifically, Caspar, is that potentially a disease for which gene editing could be an answer, either partially or fully?
Yeah, and I think this is an active area of research. I believe it's investigators in France and in Brazil who are looking into gene editing as a solution against coffee rust. And I know also that researchers in Mexico are targeting coffee borer, the beetle, is it, to make it resistant, make the plant resistant to that pest. So yeah, there are various groups around the world using these technologies already to tackle these problems.
What do you think the coffee industry, this is a question for both of you, what could they look to do pre-competitively then and as a priority action sort of going forward to continue production, but also to obviously protect farmers, the climate, the land? That's quite a big question, I appreciate that.
I think the problem at the moment is that there are so many voices in this area, and some of them are aligned and some of them are contradictory. And I think it's very difficult, if you're sitting in any part of the value chain, but particularly if you're a buyer, a major player, to really dig in deep and find out what the truth is, or where you really want to focus your resources. And I don't think we've had an open forum for doing this. I think we need a really almost like a COP for coffee, where we thrash out exactly what we need to do within the framework of climate change, because that's the game changer, isn't it? If it wasn't for climate change, there's plenty of other sustainability issues to deal with, but climate change is so all-encompassing that would be the focus. But I think we need to have some consensus and a real, an agreed pathway of what we should do. And I guess it's like the COP, but it's also like the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. Make it evidence-based. It's not just about the people with the loudest voice. It's let's look at the evidence, let's agree on the evidence, and then devise a pathway that's going to be meaningful in terms of projected climate change. Because what I see in coffee and other crops is a lot of work that is progressing climate resilience forward, but not at the speed that it needs to move to keep up with accelerated climate change. And I've mentioned some of the figures around decadal changes in temperature, and it's not called accelerated climate change for nothing. We really need to get our skates on.
So you would propose let's call it a cup of coffee. And Caspar, what would your answer to that question be? What we can do, or what the industry could do sort of pre-competitively going forward?
I mean, the industry is at kind of it's restricted by what the consumers are willing to have, as well as what the countries, the legislation is allowing them to do. But where I think the research element comes into play is that what researchers can do is create these varieties and test them in the field, and the proof of the pudding is that you've got farmers that, if you've got a product, you've got a crop that will answer a problem, they're going to grow it. If the coffee either doesn't grow well, doesn't sell well, they're not going to grow it. So really it's about having the raw materials, i.e. the plants that resist this stress or resist this pathogen or insect or whatnot, and testing that. I think that's where we can really make a big difference. And with that starting material, it's up to the governments and the consumers to then catch up. I mean, unfortunately, as Aaron said, there's a lot of misinformation, and people are scared of GMOs, even gene editing, because they've had this message from other players that there's something to be afraid of, and there isn't. I mean, there's something to be aware of, but just like any other plant, crop, species that you investigate, whether that's a new food that comes onto the market, it doesn't matter its origin. It's always going down a regulatory process for consumer and environmental health. That has to be a given. But actually, the technologies per se, there's nothing to be afraid of.
Well, I think we'll open some questions, because I'm aware that we're almost at 5 to 4 now. That's really flowed in this time. I wondered if anyone has any questions that we'd like to put. We've got one in actually from Christine at Sukafina that I'll put to you both. And it's this idea of, when we're talking about future-proofing the coffee industry, how do you both see the role of sort of alternative coffees, molecular coffee, or cellular coffee, she says, or compound coffee, which sustainably grown microbes? Is there a role for this, or what is its role?
Yeah, so there has been a few beanless coffees produced over the last few years. The first one to really come to the fore was based on reinventing coffee from scratch, i.e. getting a sort of a carrier substance and then adding the major flavor compounds. So it's a completely sort of synthetic coffee made from plant-based products, and there's nothing that's not involved with a coffee bean at all. And then there's what we call cellular agriculture. So you take a cell of coffee and you bulk it up in a laboratory, like in vitro, like on a petri dish, but on a massive scale in a bioreactor. So it is actually coffee, and then it's manipulated in a number of ways, made into a powder and roasted. And there's also, I don't know much about this, I haven't heard much about this, microbial coffee or fungal coffee, where you're growing bacteria or fungi to produce a substance that's then treated in some way and made into a coffee. So they're all synthetic coffees. And the idea, I guess the main marketing thrust behind these coffees is that they're deforestation free, use very little water, require very little in terms of fossil fuel inputs or fertilizers, etc., etc. And we know that agriculture is a major cause of a producer of greenhouse gases, particularly livestock production. But I think it's really early days on this because I don't see I don't see the science behind some of those claims. I'd like to see more transparency on exactly what the inputs are, what the carbon usage might be, and trying to find out what they actually taste like is incredibly. We're not seeing any online reviews, etc. I guess the key questions are, what does that do to the sector that we already have? Do we want to be producing all our coffee in bioreactors and laboratories? I think the answer is absolutely not. What happens to those 100 million people in the coffee farming sector alone? What happens to them? What are the environmental implications of doing that? And I think they're probably extremely negative. So I think there's all sorts of things to take into consideration. I don't think that's going to be the case. I always think it's going to be a niche product. I think people will always want the whole food, the bean, and you can't really recreate coffee. It's not just about a few key compounds. There are lots of other things, that go into the cup. The number of compounds, the sucrose, all the other elements to it. And there's also, we drink coffee because we like the variety. Would we want to be drinking a coffee that always tastes the same? And again, I think the answer is probably no. I do think it has a place, but I don't think that space is going to be a big sector of the coffee world.
Well, Christine's very happy to hear that answer, she says, so thank you very much for that. Aaron, Caspar, I'll put this other question to you rather than have you answer the same one there because we're running out of time. But as Liam has been in touch saying, as an independent coffee roaster, it's easy to feel helpless with regards to climate change's effects on coffee. We can work towards carbon neutral negative as a company, but what else would you recommend we do? What are the other options available?
I mean, as an independent coffee roaster, I would suggest ensuring that you're buying from people that are actively engaged in habitat restoration or maintaining their area in a kind of climate positive way. I think it's really key to have those kind of stories, not just for your own ethical stance, but also for the consumer. And there's a lot of interest from consumers to know where their coffee's from and how that coffee fits in to the local economy and local ecology. So I think that's a powerful message to put across.
Okay, and
Yeah, I would agree.
Try and quickly squeeze one last question in. It's from Malcolm at UCC Coffee, and he says, regarding the cup of coffee idea, we've got a patent on that, by the way. As an industry with profit motivation, how might the panel suggest a strong outcome could be achieved? Are there precedents in other fields?
Yeah, look, it has to work. All this has to work right the way across the value chain. Whether it's new plants or biodiversity conservation, it has to work across the value chain. And I've been involved in projects where we have had outcomes that are extremely beneficial in terms of the environment and forest conservation and for farmer income. So it's possible. I just think we need to really work towards that goal. I think there is enough margin in the value chain to achieve all those things. Maybe we'll be paying a little bit more for our coffee, but I really think it's something that's achievable, and we have to do it. It's not, biodiversity preservation and carbon reduction in greenhouse gas emissions is not something we'd like to do or we feel we're obliged to do. We have to do it. If we don't do it, there won't be any industry. There won't be, we're talking about our survival here. So we have to do it.
Caspar, a last thought from you on our final question.
Sorry, I didn't hear you there.
Sorry, I was saying a final thought from you on our last question. Can we, how might the panel suggest a strong outcome could be achieved if we have a sort of COP for coffee, as it were?
Yeah, I echo Aaron's points completely. It's obviously there's competition in coffee. I mean, people are working in the same area, but it has to be a kind of unified front against these climate forces, and there needs to be an overall overarching strategy to defend the industry against it.
I think we could maybe get this cup of coffee idea off the ground and get Malcolm along on the panel as well with you too. That seems like a good place to wrap it up because we are out of time. So thank you so much. Thanks to Liam and Christine and Malcolm for the questions, and to Paul as well. And a huge thank you to Dr. Aaron Davis and Dr. Caspar Chater from Royal Botanic Gardens Kew for coming along today and sharing your expertise and your insight. It's been really useful, and hopefully everyone's enjoyed it. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll send out a questionnaire later for some feedback on it, and I'm sure this will be made available as well for people to look at later if they missed it. So thank you very much everybody for joining us. Thanks.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Katrina. Thanks everybody.
Cheers.